value for community, whether that's the community in our lab or community in the broader society. And of course, no time like the present has it been ever so important that we really think about that we really think about helping and working with and partnering with communities, right, of all nationalities, ethnicities, backgrounds, etc. And nobody does community work the way that my dear friend, Dr. Sheena E. does. So Sheena's work has been recognized through numerous papers in top tier journals and conferences such as CHI and CSCW. She's gotten several best papers in CHI and CSCW. Sheena, so her work is very well known and very well recognized, but not just sort of formally in those ways. I think also just by those of us who know her and love her, we always appreciate the opportunity to come to her and gather wisdom and insight from her and her deep work with communities. And so it is my pleasure to introduce you guys to Dr. Sheena E. She is an associate professor at DePaul. Sheena got her PhD at Northwestern. And then before that, we were together at Georgia Tech where she got her master's degree in computer science. And so I am going to turn it over to Sheena. She is going to talk about some of her more recent work where she has been deeply ingrained in communities and now is beginning to think at the policy and whole city level. So with that, I will turn it over to Sheena.
Great. Thank you. Thanks so much. All right, let's see. I'm guessing you can, if you see me like moving, like looking, I'm looking at different screens. So I'm looking at you all over here, and then here's the screen that has the camera. Thank you for inviting me. I'm guessing you can see my screen. I'm guessing I'm sharing. Is that right? Maybe I'm sharing the wrong screen. Am I sharing the right screen?
No, we see it. We see it.
You're good.
Okay. All right. It's okay. So yeah, so thanks so much for inviting me to come. I have a love for the University of Maryland. I'm from Virginia, so it's very close to near and dear to my heart, which is where I grew up and still have lots and lots of family. So yeah, again, thanks, and I thank you, Tammy, for that really nice introduction. I don't think that I could have ever written anything like that about myself, and it just builds me up. It kind of feels like what Beth was saying about seeing everybody's faces. So it makes me feel really warm inside. Okay, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about countering structural oppression and through design and through co-design with resource-constrained communities. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the type of work that I'm doing now and also the evolution of that work. And so structural oppression is described as any unjust situation where systemically and over a long period of time, one group denies another group access to the resources of the society. And this comes out of the Collins work. Patricia Hill Collins, who's actually was at the University of Maryland or is at the University of Maryland. And we can't talk about oppression without understanding power and the systems that support domination and oppression of people who have been historically disenfranchised. And so even as I talk about Collins's work, she created the matrix of domination, or what we call the domains of power, in her book, The Black Feminist Thought, to describe how four interrelated domains of power actually organize relationships in society and power relationships in society. And Black Feminist Thought has two main contributions. One is fostering a fundamental paradigm shift in how we think about unjust power relations and reconceptualization of social relationships of domination and resistance. But then also it addresses an ongoing epistemic debates concerning power and dynamics that underlie what counts as knowledge. And so today I'm going to talk about more of the first part of that, the former, rather than the latter, though I'll recommend some work that does get into that in our field. So this approach of power analysis, it really helps us inform us about how power is organized and how it operates. And according to Collins, these four interrelated domains of power serve purposes in relation to maintaining the status quo. So the first one is structural. So that's where how power organizes oppression, right? And it's typically through laws and policies that are created. And the next one that's related to that is the implementation of those laws and policies, and that's disciplinary. And we really think about how are these things administered and managed? How is oppression administered and managed? And it's really through the implementation of the laws and policies that are created at the structural level. And the next one is hegemonic, and it really talks about the circulation of oppressive ideas through culture and media. And we'll talk more about the types of examples. And then interpersonal, which is the individual experiences that people may have. And so these four domains of intersection power is really complex. And it's just one way that we can begin to think about how is oppression implemented. And so throughout this talk, I'm going to use this framework to kind of frame how I've done my work in the past, how I've done my work and how I think about oppression. And so now we've talked a bit about oppression. So the question is why resource constrained communities? And so resource constrained communities, we really focus on researchers show that technology has the potential to worsen inequities, right? We have lots of that work in HCI that shows that when we think about inequities, technology is actually not necessarily an equalizer, but it has more so the power to have a negative impact. And so resource constrained communities also have historically faced a considerable amount of social and economic disadvantage due to these powers and oppression that has happened, which has led to the lack of investment and other unfair policies and practices at the institutional level. And so our work, there's been a recent push in HCI to kind of address these issues around the histories of oppression and racism, et cetera, that's interwoven into our research and our research interventions and our approach. And so this kind of signifies a shift in our design orientation from looking from individual problems to kind of building and thinking about structures that counter these systems that exist. And so there's been a significant amount of work done in that. And when we think about social justice and equitable design and design justice, and so these are just a few of the papers that I know of that exist, and there are lots more that's more recent and it's coming out. And even outside of the field of HCI, we have Ruha Benjamin's book on race after technology, and Virginia Eubanks's book on automating inequality, and other work that's into STS space that is really focused on understanding systems of oppression and how they design technology uses, impact social issues, et cetera. And so recalling the second part of what I said that Black feminist thought thinks about, there's also this notion of our work is also focused on understanding unjust systems within the field of HCI. And so we recently wrote a paper around that was published in CSCW this year. And if you're interested in a preprint version, I can send that out if you reach out to me. That really focuses on within HCI, what types of systems are in place that also support inequities. And so the theme of my work is how can we design technologies, practices, and policies that counter social issues catalyzed by structural oppression in resource-constrained communities. And so I do realize that this is a pandemic. This is right around lunchtime, your time. It's 11 something my time. So I always like to start with the end of the talks, which basically is just in case you miss it or you have to leave. But here's the big takeaways for my talk, which are 3 big takeaways, which is technology exists within and interacts with the structures of oppression and power. And so it's our job as designers and researchers to really critically examine the historical and the current systems and policies that create inequities, but also how our work really critically examine how the work that we do has the potential to counter or perpetuate these systems of oppression. And then the second one is that technology design has the potential to amplify counter structures that exist. And by counter structures, I mean counters to structural oppression that already exist, that are community led and that are community initiatives where their goal is to build power against or replace dominating structures that have been oppressive. And so we have an opportunity to actually work with community partners who are intentionally countering historical oppression and to design technology to support those community-led efforts. Because the goal for all of our work should be so that it's sustainable beyond our research grants, beyond our research projects, et cetera, right? And so we can do that by situating our solutions within identifying community-led work that intentionally counters structural oppression, and then situating our work within the local community to leverage, and that leverages community assets. And so, and this, and even as I say this, this might require that we as researchers and academics and et cetera, that we commit to activist approaches that may conflict with traditional research and traditional research methods and the currency that we use in our field. And so we have to grapple with that, the invisible work that's required, but also, what needs to be done to still sustain within our work, but still make sure our solutions are sustainable. So I'm going to talk about two projects. So my work kind of spans many different areas of social issues, from maternal health to smart technologies and city technologies like civic tech to engage people civically. I'm going to talk about two projects around violence prevention. So I've done violence prevention work here in Chicago for quite a while now. And as well as the other project that I'm going to talk about is creating a STEM learning ecosystem. So those are the two projects that I'm going to talk about in this particular talk. And so my setting is in Chicago, and obviously Chicago is a very diverse city, and with a relatively high poverty rate at 20%, et cetera. And so that's the context in which we do all of our work. And so I'll start with the first one, which is really violence prevention as a counter to structural oppression. And for us, we're really focused on amplifying a community-led violence prevention efforts. And this work was done with myself and Jessa Dickinson, who's a PhD candidate, my PhD student. She'll probably be on the market next year. And so she's been excellent in leading much of this work and thinking about issues around structural oppression. So I have to give a shout out in case anybody's looking for a postdoc. She's amazing. All right. So again, in addition to my team, who is a wonderful group, and this is just a few of them who I could grab for a picture that day, but one of my lead partner in this is Jalen Author, who is the current director of priorities and strategies and violence prevention at Chicago CRED, which is a organization here in Chicago that leads transformation and economic and violence transformation here in Chicago. And so Jalen was very much so lead in this work and partner in this work. And if folks have questions about how do you have good partnerships, I can give good examples. That Jalen is a great example of an excellent partner. So to start with this first project, street outreach work is an approach to countering traditional policing practices that have failed communities, particularly Black and Brown communities, and led to distrust, over-policing, and mass incarceration, to take more transformative justice approaches to violence. And so by violence, I'm actually referring to mental, emotional, physical harm to others, and the types of violence actually ranges that they address. That ranges from interpersonal or domestic violence, war violence. They've worked in, this has been an international project and program where they work in war-torn countries, street violence, gang violence, et cetera. And street outreach workers are community residents who have three goals, and they take a transformative justice approach as opposed to a punitive approach that traditional law enforcement typically takes. And their approach is to, one, detect and mediate potential violent conflict that is happening in community, in their own community, to identify and provide resources to high-risk individuals, and then to mobilize the community to change social norms around violence and the acceptance of violence. And so this approach relies really heavily on the credibility and the assets of both the street outreach workers and the local community. Keep in mind that street outreach workers work in a community setting that they live in and grew up in and are a part of. So they have this credibility and trust because people know people know them, they grew up there, et cetera. And they only work within the communities that they are from. And so they work in particular neighborhoods. They don't typically work directly with the police or law enforcement, though police will contact them to let them know that something may be brewing in the neighborhood. Maybe there's been a shooting. Hospitals also connect with them. All of the local hospitals typically have a social worker that will connect with the street outreach workers to let them know that there has been a shooting, because their goal is to prevent retaliation before it happens. And so they don't work directly with the police at all. And typically it's a one-way communication stream with the police connecting and contacting them. And so the research question that we had was, how can we support street outreach work and their conflict mediation practices, and how is street outreach work counterstructural? And so in order to understand street outreach work, we have to go back to understanding systems of oppression in a historical context, and what does it mean for violence, and why are certain communities experience higher levels of violence than others. And so we have to understand structural violence, which is defined as the policies and the systems that create inequity and harm in these communities. And so first, we know that opportunity inequity drives violence and crime. And it's a result of historic and current racist policies that fuel residential segregation, disinvestment, mass incarceration, et cetera. And so racial disparities are designed through institutional structures such as the criminal justice system, which acts not as, and this is a quote from Alexander in 2012, Mass Incarceration, but not as an independent system, but more as a gateway into much larger system of racial stigmatization and permanent marginalization to ensure that subordinate status of groups defined by race. And so people of color, we know, are comprised of about 37% of the US population, but people of color are also comprised of 67% of the prison population. And there's more than 2.2 million people that are incarcerated in the US. And so the criminal justice system effectively enforces oppression and has a limited impact on actual crime and violence. And so there's no link to say that the more people that you lock up, the less violence or the less crime happens in a community. In fact, the exact opposite. So mass incarceration physically removes, we also know that mass incarceration physically removes people from their communities and from their families, which is a form of structural violence towards these communities that undermines a community capacity to provide mutual support and to prevent interpersonal violence and crime. And so we know that that's one of the structural barriers. The other one we know is deficit narratives normalize racial inequities and attribute the problems in communities rather than to the systems of oppression and structures that kind of create an advantage in white communities. Instead, one of the things Kendi wrote in his book, Stamped, is racist ideas have done their job on us. We have a hard time recognizing that racial discrimination is the sole cause of racial disparities in this country and in the world at large. And so one example of historical persistence is this deficit narrative and the concept of Black criminality. So this, which attributes Black engagement in crime to personal and cultural inferiority and views crime as linked to Blackness or Black communities rather than it being a societal issue that's attributed to the current status of things in a community. And it uses the Black crime rate as a metric for progress of the Black community. So associating criminality with Blackness obscures the structural inequities driving violent crime. And it's a powerful deficit narrative that suppresses the resistance to uh, that suppresses resistance to mass incarceration by kind of normalizing this notion of criminalization of Black and brown people. So creating counter narratives to this notion of Blackness as associated with criminality is a way that racialized groups have resisted deficit narratives, and using personal compositive accounts of experiences to provide, this context of analysis of this racialized system and their interaction and engagement in that system, and how does that intersect with the constructs of race and class is one thing that people have done. So thinking about counter narratives. And so when we think about the domains of power, particularly in this particular project, we think about the laws, the sentencing, the policing, even redlining in the communities in Chicago. And if anybody is from Chicago, you know that there are different parts of Chicago, which makes different Chicagos. And so the South and West Side, et cetera, has been historically redlined. So you have issues of concentrated poverty, lack of investment, et cetera. And those are the laws that were created by laws and policies that were historic, but also still upheld today. And so as far as disciplinary, who enforces those laws? It's law enforcement, of course, courts, prisons, mass incarceration, and other agencies that kind of focus on incarceration, et cetera. And then if we think about hegemonic, which is the culture and the media. So lots of times you hear about Chicago and you hear these negative stories, these negative stereotypes, Black criminality and stereotyping what these communities and what the experiences are like in these communities are. And then you have the interpersonal, which is the experiences of Black people that have led to distrust against law enforcement, against government, against the city, et cetera, due to their, due to policies, et cetera. And then there's extreme lack of opportunities within these communities. And so that's if we apply the domains of power in this situation. And so the objective of this project was to support, we had three big objectives, which is to support community outreach, to encourage the use of different mediation strategies, and to enable street outreach workers across the city to connect with each other. And so we designed a mobile app to support these violence prevention workers. And keep in mind, street outreach workers have been around for a long time now, for decades now. And so we co-design it with several street outreach worker organizations, and we'll call that Street Peace, and we'll call this the Street Peace app. And so the app has, just walking through the features of the app, it has a home screen where we talk about like mediation guidance. So all of the prevention workers, all the street outreach workers actually put in the mediations, and there's over 10 years. We're connected to a database of over 10 years of effective mediation strategies. And so while they might put in the mediations, I just want to caveat it with, it's always anonymous. It just says, near a street corner named X, Y, and Z, this is a type of conflict, and here's the strategies that I use to resolve it. And there are between 13 and 15 strategies. And so in the case that they would like to put in mediations, then we have the ability to use that database to recommend, and I'll talk a little bit about that more. The second part is in the home screen, it has a quick refresher, quick strategy of refreshers that rotates. We have self-care tips because a lot of what they're dealing with is very heavy. And so these actual short videos of self-care strategies were created by other street outreach workers who think a lot about self-care, and then mediation statistics of how they're doing and how their team is doing. So just a little bit more on the mediation guidance. It draws from the historic mediation data that I mentioned, the database that already exists. And that's how it suggests strategies for a given context using a set of key parameters. And those parameters were set in the co-design process with the street outreach workers. So they set, here's what the parameters should be. And then we used algorithms that they agreed with. And, we tweaked the algorithms over time to say that, to identify which mediation strategies are most effective for a certain type of conflict. The second feature is a connect feature, which allows violence prevention workers and street outreach workers across the city to connect with each other by posting on a shared feed through private chats. They can upload photos, etc. There's a training room where these are short videos that are refresher tutorials to increase familiarity with street outreach approaches. And then there's an alert feature, which really, when situations escalate, the alert features enables on-the-spot assistance in an emergency, a text message to the group. So in deploying the app, it was 3 months, 3 different organizations, 6 sites, which are essentially different neighborhoods. And the methods that we use is community building, obviously, and I can talk more about that offline, but it's 6 to 9 months before we would even get started, just building our relationship and building the trust with the street outreach workers, as well as with their organizations and the administration in their organizations. We did pre and post interviews, we did pre and post surveys. We collected log data from every time they used the app. You could see when they logged on and which what they used, which features they used or looked at or viewed. And then we did quantitative and qualitative analysis. And so looking at the app usage, we had 56 street outreach workers and staff complete the pre and post survey. 80% of that 56 or 48 actually installed the apps on their phones over the course of the 3 months. And we recorded 40 mediations, close to 300 posts, and then likes, hundreds of likes. And they also had the ability to send one-on-one messages. So there were at least 29. These are not the actual messages, but 29 current and ongoing conversations that were happening one-on-one. And so overall, what we found was that social capital, when we use measures of social capital, which is traditionally, there are social capital measures that you can use in a survey, pre and post survey, showed that the app increased social capital, and that goes with other sites. So within one site, they meet every day, essentially, right? Almost every day. I think Mondays are typically a day that they take off, et cetera, depending on who they are, but they meet every day. So not with Insight so much, but definitely within other organizations. We saw across different sites within their organization, and then throughout with other violence prevention organizations, we saw social capital increase. And then the qualitative findings, which I'm going to focus more on in this talk, is what we saw was that they leveraged the citywide network of street outreach workers in conflict, right? So we saw that the connect feed, because it was the most used feature of the app, all the study participants really engaged with it in a deep way. And the biggest way that we saw was that through immediate practices on how they connect across the city. And so, for example, one person said, just for instance, you respond to a shooting or whatever, the person that knows about it, he might be some kin to a street outreach worker from another site. You know what I'm saying? A little street information, that's good information that's beneficial to our work. It's good to have communication with somebody else from another site. And so people really found that leveraging the connect feed so that they could connect with other street outreach workers was really important. And before this, there was no way to actually do that other than seeing somebody in person and just kind of knowing that they're a street outreach worker from another neighborhood. And a lot of people kind of stick within their neighborhood, right? Like you can't actually do work outside of. And so the goal of this app wasn't simply to kind of build an online community of street outreach workers, but also to facilitate offline relationships. And so we saw that was how the app was used as well, which is to facilitate this community building through in-person events. And so one person wrote, I use the app when we have an event coming up. We want to invite people. I use it for that. It's effective to get information out. And when the other guys on the team have events, they let us know. Sometimes I see stuff on there about other events they have where we might not know about it. And they typically, these types of events are like vigils or community block parties, etc. street outreach workers also explained that posting and seeing other images and messages from street outreach sites across the city helped them to see the collective impact of all of their work across the city, which they described as being inspiring and motivating. Well, one person said this positive stuff, pictures, with your coworkers, the way away on the other side of town. I mean, it's like, I promise you, this is like an excellent idea for us. This is a really important quote because even within that, some folks quoted that the problem with their work is that if they do their job successfully, it's invisible. So people don't actually, there's no headlines about it that says, there was no shooting yesterday, right? Like, or last weekend, or et cetera, right? There's only headlines when there are. And so they wanted, by seeing other outreach workers, and most of the posts had photos attached to them. And so by seeing the other outreach workers post photos, et cetera, they felt like it was really positive, and it supported this notion of unity across the city. Street outreach workers also saw the potential for using this app as a tool to counter and subvert the structures that have harmed and that are harming their community. And so, namely, concentrated incarceration and disinvestment. So they described how the app could be used to document their work, to gain funding, and also change the narrative of Black criminality, and to heal the relationships that their community has as a impact of structural violence. And so one person wrote, Hosea wrote, because we all came from the same walk of life and I got a record. So sometimes us Black folks, we feel like kind of targeted. And now we get opportunity to kind of clean this stuff up. And I just want to give them the opportunity. And this was in particular to talk about a counteract towards recidivism. And the posts that he was mentioning that he shared was how to expunge your record. And many of the street outreach workers have a record. And he wanted to talk to them more about how to expunge their record. And there was a process in which he had gone through himself and wanted other people so that they could have other employment opportunities outside of street outreach work, if they wanted to go beyond that. And then the emotional support that violence prevention workers and street outreach workers provide each other was evident in the interactions that they had in the workplace. So we spent a lot of time like in their space and in their settings. But they also decided to use the app to kind of do that, to think about care and what we call communities of care to support themselves in the emotional. And one person wrote, we talk about how to better ourselves and how to better the program and our participants. If you need some help, I got you. It's a real loving community. And so that's the types of messages and the response to the messages that we saw online. And one important thing to note is that the privacy of the app was a key reason why street outreach workers were comfortable sharing on the Connect feed. And many of them were disparaged mainstream social media. And so, for example, this notion of, I don't like Facebook, Instagram, I don't like none of it, because I feel like that's what's driving a lot of this violence that's going on right now. And they're making so much money off of it. And if they watched it like they should, a lot of this violence going on wouldn't be happening. And so this was not a sentiment from one or two people. This is a sentiment from the vast majority of street outreach workers, which is they don't communicate via mainstream social media platforms because they don't trust it, and because they also feel like it's an exploitation of their community. And they see, and much of their work is actually, if they do use it, it's to find potential conflicts that are brewing, because many of those conflicts do stem from social media, or start on social media, and then they come into the physical world. And so our findings suggest that while street outreach workers that focus on violence prevention saw value in using the app to get support while mediating conflict, their deeper motivations for using this app really stem from their desire to heal their community and to transform the institutions and policies that perpetuate this cycle of violence. And street outreach workers use the app to support communities of care and to engage in counter narratives as a method to support their approach to counter structural oppression. And so remember, we started with this, and I think that this kind of gives an overview of how you could see, one, how their work does that, but then also how the app supports their work in doing that. And so the second project that I'm going to end with is really thinking about creating STEM learning ecosystems. And this is a project that I worked on with Nicole Pinkard at the Digital Youth Network. And we have an amazing team. Denise Naku is also on that team as a PI, a co-PI with us. And we have an amazing team, including a great postdoc researcher, Naomi Thompson, et cetera. And here's some of our wonderful mentors, at least for this year, who actually lead. And these mentors are in high school and college, and they actually lead our middle school girls program. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to go slightly faster on this one because much of this work has been published. And so if you're interested, you'll see the citations at the end, or you can ask me about it. We've also published it on our website as well, if you are interested in having access to any of this. But what I really want to do is talk about the journey of creating this project and some of the things that we really focused on. So we all know these numbers, right? Women are scarce in computer science, et cetera. Black women and Latina women are also scarce. This is nothing new. There's tons of other spaces and other opportunities that kind of think about STEM and computing education, how to make inclusive environments and inclusive curriculum. And when we think about the learner, we think about this is an ecosystem that we're working with the learner in the middle, and we have in school, we have after school, we have their peers, we have caring adults, mentors, et cetera. And this journey, and what I'm going to do, like I said, is going to walk through the different journey of creating the program, the Divas program, and how issues of structural oppression has become more and more apparent. We didn't really start there initially, but it's become, over the years, it's become more and more apparent, these issues and understanding these issues, and we've incorporated them into our solution. So we start with the first phase where our goal was to try to create a program to support Black and Latino girls, engagement and interest in STEM and computing. So we created a middle school program design to do exactly that. And there are 4 main components of the program, which is really thinking about self-paced, project-based learning opportunities, face-to-face community of learners. So you have adult mentors and high school mentors who are cool, way cooler than Nicole and I. And they build relationship with those mentors, et cetera. And then we have an online platform that we designed and built and created that they use to kind of connect with each other. And it's what we call an online social learning platform where girls have access to resources and they develop a portfolio of work, and then they interact with others. And then we have alternative instruction through these narratives that launch the project-based work. And the narratives counter stereotypes about who participates in STEM and computing, et cetera. And over the years, we've had over 500 girls participate. And so the methods are obviously community building with community building. I don't know how that built. Observations and interviews, surveys, online ethnographies, and then we did qualitative and quantitative analysis. And so we've written lots of papers about this, we've shown that the program increases knowledge about STEM concepts, shifts in language when discussing STEM, increases in interest, and outcomes were environments that kind of looked a little bit like, you're not going to be able to hear the sound here, but they're singing and dancing. But this is what the program looks like. And they have their music and they have their projects and they're just going off and doing their thing. And here's like one of the mentors, and there's another mentor who's over here somewhere sitting with the girls, et cetera, right? And so that's kind of what it looks like. And when we were running this program, we might have 5 or 6 classrooms that look like this. And I remember on a Saturday, I just took my phone out and was like, as I walked through one of them. So we've had over 500 girls successfully go through the Divas program, but we also recognize that there are challenges, right? And so those challenges really think about the translation of interest beyond Divas into other programs, interest identity over time, long-term sustainable impact, et cetera. So we knew that these things were a challenge, but we also know one of the most critical things are families. And we know that families care and invest in the learning of their children, but we know if we can think about the home and families, it might help us understand a little bit better. So how do we engage? So our second question was, how do we engage parents and caring adults in sustained efforts to support girls and participation in STEM? So this led to our second phase of Divas, which is really about families in STEM. So instead of 4 components of Divas, we had 5, which is then having a caring adult network. So the caring adult network were workshops where we worked with parents to understand their roles as learners, where we created a support of network, like in-person network and an online platform that supports parents in communicating. And the goal was to kind of grow the parents' and their girls' confidence in STEM, and to provide resources beyond Divas. And I will say this, what we found was that the parents were deeply engaged in their girls' learning, and that enhancing the community concerns between parents, we saw an uptake in the usage of our online platform, where parents were using it to kind of widen the brokering opportunities for their young girls, right? So they were signing their girls up for more programs, et cetera. But in those conversations, another thing we found was that there are huge structural barriers to participation. And parents shared with us, like the lack of public transportation, the lack of access to opportunities in their neighborhoods, really complex relationships with the history of the city that's resulted from intergenerational learning. So things like, who belongs over on that side of the city, right? We don't belong, we're not invited over there, et cetera. And so some of that has come from things like historical of redlining, et cetera. So our third question was, how do we design socio-technical systems that intentionally counter structural oppression and racism embedded in and outside of STEM computing education? And how do we develop an equitable, sustainable STEM learning ecosystem? And so again, we think about the domains of power. Redlining, issues of redlining has caused concentrated poverty, inequitable out-of-school learning spaces, desegregation of schools, this lack of transportation to white areas that may have more STEM opportunities, et cetera. And one of the communities, and due to some of these laws, including this notion of desegregation, some of the communities, particularly like the community that I showed in the redlining, which we work with closely, they bus Black and brown students to different schools, but that means that you could live on one block and the kids could go to a different school, because that's how it's implemented. That's how the laws are implemented. And so that means that the school, it was desegregated. Schools were desegregated, but housing wasn't desegregated. So that means that you don't have the cultural capital, and you don't have the social capital and collective capital that normally exists in the other neighborhoods, where people can kind of rally together. So you could have parents who live next door who don't know each other, or live on the same block and you don't know each other because your kids go to a different school, because that's how the laws are implemented. And then inequity in Black and brown teachers and mentors, et cetera. And then when we think about culture and media, there are obviously negative images of Black and brown women and girls, stereotypes of who belongs in STEM and who belongs in computing. And then when we think about interpersonal experiences, we have to think about the violent experiences in STEM and computing spaces, perceptions of unwelcome communal spaces, the breakdown of community, social capital, et cetera. And Jaquita Thomas and Yolanda Rankin, they've written extensively more recently about violence that occurs in STEM and computing spaces, et cetera. So again, our question was, how do we counter some of these things? And so that led us to our third phase, which is really thinking about community ecology. And so our goal was recognizing, the importance of parents and recognizing them. We expanded the CAN program, right? The Caring Adult Network and the parent program to include showcases, social events where they could build social capital. So that means that, yes, you live in the same neighborhood and you don't know each other, et cetera, but you might have the same concerns, and maybe together you can build a social relationship that could lead to efficacy and and communal understanding and knowledge. Also, making changes at the district, requesting changes at the district level, et cetera, because now you have a collective group as opposed to a group that's factioned off, et cetera. So we created like numerous social events that builds relationship between parents. And then also allowing parents who wanted to focus on things like activism and deeper levels of support. So even we built out our online platform to even support parents even more than that. So thinking about how do we integrate them more into the child's learning, but then also how do we make sure that they have educational opportunities if they would like them. And then the second thing we did was build a collective where we took a systems approach, where we thought about other community. So if you think about community as the ecosystem, so thinking about things like the library, the YMCA, et cetera, et cetera. So thinking about those systems that exist and trying to work with them to create inclusive environments and environments that are, welcoming spaces, et cetera. And so that goes beyond like a one-time event for our particular demographic. Instead, it thinks about like overall, if the YMCA is offering a STEM program, how do you make that a program that is, that is welcoming and inclusive? And in our thinking about our Divas Collective, we champion engagement in families. We think about long-term partnerships, et cetera. And still, right, we still have this same issue, even though we still work at a collective. We work with specifically other organizations using some of a framework to think about creating inclusive spaces and et cetera. We think quite a bit about infrastructure and change at the city level. And so we've started something called Community Conversations, where we work with, where we connect with school district leadership, out of school time location providers, and community leaders, et cetera, to engage in data discussions that expose the cultural and historical barriers of participation of youth. And we kind of make those things visible. So we bring those to the forefront of the conversation. So these data-driven community conversations and workshops we have. And we really talk about how do we leverage, make visible the assets that are in a community, the learning assets, but then how do we leverage those assets to transform the community? And so we do that by creating maps, and those maps are interactive digital maps that we created. And the types of things that we have on the maps are, we don't just map STEM programs, but we map all programs that exist. So the program locations, the offerings, the places and facilitates places where even if programs don't exist, but where programs could exist, like it might be religious institutions, other, parks, et cetera, et cetera. We map a variety of program content, the type of content that is in a certain community, the walkability to these spaces, hotspots, when we think about crime, population density, what the interest, we work with the school district to get the interest. And so the goal and the preliminary results of this really shows that data-driven community conversations have the ability to give a voice to Black and Brown stakeholders regarding what and how and where youth programming should be offered and what their community should, and how they can leverage their current assets, like I mentioned, but also how they can pull together to request other assets, either from the city and or through other foundations or funds, et cetera. And so we go back to the domains of power, and this really does a way that we're trying to think structurally of how to counter some of the things that we know already exist. And so that's why I always like to start with my key takeaways. So hopefully that you saw these three things throughout the talk, and that's it. I think my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheena. This is amazing. You have lots of great comments in the chat. And we have a few minutes for questions. And Hernisa already added a first question, I guess, that we could start with. If Hernisa, you want to unmute yourself and share. Other people have questions, you can either type in the chat, raise your hand, or wait for us to finish, and you can unmute yourself and ask after Hernisa.
Great.
Thank you. Great talk. I really enjoyed it. I was just wondering, and maybe you just deployed the the Strict Peace Act, but I was wondering whether if it was still ongoing during the COVID, if you saw a difference in like the type of usage people, reported with it.
This was a couple years. This is before COVID that we did the deployment. And we can talk more about like how do you work with community organizations and environments, because they actually own the I worked with I worked with general counsel at my university as well as general counsel at theirs to transfer the IP, so they have the ability to use it beyond beyond my work, et cetera, and beyond the funding that I had, which was supported by NSF and other organizations. But one thing I will say is that even though we don't deploy the app per se, we're very much so still in touch with the street outreach workers. And we've had lots of conversations about their experience during COVID. And much of that is that one, that, COVID just makes visible the inequities and oppressions that already exist, right? And what the outcomes of those things are, health-wise, et cetera. And their job has become more than just street outreach work, but it has become more about information sharing about COVID and debunking some of the myths about COVID and telling people where to get help and where they can get tested and et cetera. When really, their focus was initially like, let's focus on mediating violent conflict. It has also become more complex for them just doing their normal jobs because kids are out of school, right? And so when kids are out of school, that doesn't mean that they're not on their street corners or they're not walking down the street or they're not blah, 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 yada, yada. And then there's less programs that normally would have, 14 to 16 to 18-year-olds. So over the summer, for example, in Chicago, there's typically a program that allows young people to be hired. But then with COVID, you can't really have that happen in the way. And so their job has become much more complex than it was before, which is already a job that is extremely complex. And so, I mean, I don't know if that helps at all, but their work is like really, so we still stay in touch. And we've talked a lot about more recently towards the end of the summer, where you probably didn't hear as much about Chicago, they hired more street peace workers, street outreach workers. And then you saw the violent crime kind of decrease, but part of it increasing was because of some of the challenges that really, just exist because of some of the structural oppression that has always existed. It just made it more visible.
Okay, and so you have lots of questions bubbling up now. I see that Amanda and Noelle had questions, but I also saw Wayne had a question, and I think Wayne, you said you had to leave early, so should we allow you to?
I'm just gonna drop it in chat, and then I'll ping by email afterwards.
Okay.
I'd like to go ahead with Amanda.
Okay, all right. Go ahead, Amanda.
Okay, thank you so much, Sheena, for this talk. This was
amazing.
Hi, Sheena. Yeah, so I loved hearing about, you kind of like hinted at the careful work of building up this relationship with this particular organization. And I love thinking about this path of like how you can have more impact and do things in a better way by kind of building relationships with people who are already doing this work rather than me starting fresh and designing this thing, right? And I love to hear about some of the work of finding one that kind of is willing to work with you, like has that capacity, but then also like you identified, they have that counter-structural kind of mission, which I feel like sometimes it can be hard to kind of figure out where these organizations are coming from. So yeah, I just love to hear about that.
Yeah, I feel like that's probably some of the most challenging. And the reason why I like to give the example of Divas is because like literally we came in like, oh, we're going to create this thing and it's going to change, this world. And it's like, oh, so that's why we started with our own thing. And then we ended up with more of like working with city, working with community, working with organizations in these ways. So, I think that's a good example of like, my trajectory over that, at least that type of work. I think that when you're looking for community organizations to work with, when I talk about community building, I can't like really talk about it enough as far as like the amount of time and energy and effort that it takes to build community, to work with a community. And so a lot of that is invisible work that that will never be public, you know, that I don't get a publication out of, or that I don't share or anything like that. But really, what I do with all my community organizations is really talk about what my goals are. Take the violence prevention work, for example. I didn't come in with building an app, and I was very skeptical about building something. And that's the computer science in me. That's like, computer scientists is like not to build something. And so they really had to convince me of that's what was really needed. So they allowed us to do that preliminary work that's needed. But what we did was we created a memorandum of understanding where I talked about, like, you know, what my currency, and at that time I was pre-tenure. And so our currency is trying to get, you know, of course, trying to do those things that we need, like the grants and the, you know, and the publications and the whatever else. And so I talked about like kind of where we were and what our timeline was, and we wrote it down, and then we listened to them and heard them, and then we presented back and we said, this is what we heard you say. And then we presented that back to them, and then they edited it and said, this is what we can do and what we can't do. And so we kind of iterated on this document. And I don't think of it as like a contract, but I think as a living, working document where they can say, where we can honestly say we've heard what they are looking for, and we and they heard what we're looking for, right? And so we think a lot about that. And then the other thing about like, how do you identify organizations that really think about counterstructure for us is like, it took a lot of like work to like understand the history of the communities that we're working with in the context of it. So, you know, they actually approached me about working because I'd done work before in violence prevention work. And what we really need to understand is every community, every neighborhood is different. Every situation is different. So just understanding like, what are the barriers and the structures that have historically been in place, that are currently in place, et cetera. And then also like trying to get from them, what's your lived experiences of being here? So we read a lot and try to understand, and then what's the organizational goals, et cetera. And so we do this like really strange dance, because a lot of times organizations don't have like they might not have a activist social justice language in their, you know, initial documents, et cetera. But if you really talk about the type of work that they do take that approach, and it is counter-structural to structural oppression. So it took a little digging for us to try to understand like, what really do you do? And it took a lot of time for us to spend on the ground. And I say on the ground, but in their at their sites, not on the streets with them, because we can't go on the streets with them. But you know, try to understand, what does this organization really do on a daily basis? And so I think all of that work took us like months, like, you know, 6 months to really understand. But I think it made for a really, really strong partnership. And it also made for a long lasting partnership that, you know, we still talk about, you know, ways that we can work today and et cetera. You know, like I know for a fact that these are folks that I did what I was supposed to do, and they understood that. And we walked away with, they walked away feeling really good, because we didn't present anything, we didn't publish anything without their stamp of approval and them seeing it and et cetera. So I feel like it's a really good relationship that we could always go back to. And we still talk all the time, and we totally have talked about ways that we could collaborate in the future.
Thank you, Sheena. And so I know you have Layla had a similar question, I think, to what Amanda just asked. And then you have several other questions in the bank, but well, in the chat, but we're at time. So I don't know, Beth, how do you want us to, should we?
I think that if we want to take one more question, that might make sense. Do you want to scroll through there? And Sheena, you can actually scroll through. I'm sorry.
And the other thing is like, I know that you might have to end the recording, but I will hang around. I'm totally willing to hang around for some time. I got some time.
What we'll do, we'll add one more question formally. Okay. We'll say goodbye, but then we'll stay on for those who want to stay around. Does that work for everybody?
Sounds good.
Great.
Okay. All right. So I saw Noel's hand next, I think.
Ooh. This is good.
Yes, sorry. Quick question. I know you mentioned some authors that wrote about violence in STEM and community spaces, and I was just wondering if you could repeat those names.
Which one's the HCI?
You had mentioned that there was articles written about violence in STEM and community spaces. I forgot which slide it was.
Structural violence. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
Structural
Sorry,
violence?
that's what I
Yeah.
missed.
So
Okay.
there's been a lot of work on structural violence. I mean, there's been Alexander Toe. I mean, no. Okay, wait. I'm confusing. Look, I'm cheating because I'm looking at my bookshelf. This is really nice, actually, than if I was in person with you. But if you look at the new Jim Crow book by Michelle Alexander, it's 2012, really talks a lot about structural violence in communities. And so structural violence is obviously those systems of oppression network. And I think that probably the book who talks most about it, or at least the domain that I've used, is obviously Collins, Patricia Hill Collins, and she has two books: Intersectionality as a Critical Social Theory, but also Black Feminist Thought, which talks about the domains of power. And then in our field, we have, obviously, if you haven't already read it, but Design Justice by Sasha at MIT. Community-led practices to build the worlds we need, talks a lot about oppression and systems that already exist and how do we design around that. So those are some good starting points, I would say.
Thank you.
And then Joel, you had a question?
Oh, yes. I thought that was just one more question. Yeah, so I'm super curious about how do we know it's working? Right, so this is like really, really cool work, and like the problems that it's pointed at are so entrenched and distributed over time. I'm just curious, like, how you think about what do you look for to really tell if things are working, if if it's making a difference, like both in the short term and also in the long term. Like what should we be thinking about as a community as we do more of this work, and what should we be paying attention to?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like so I think when I first started working in violence prevention work and crime prevention work, I worked with a lot of criminologists, and the first thing they tell you is that there's no way to measure crime, as far as like there's no way to measure like sometimes law enforcement say, well, we enacted this thing, and then you see crime decrease, and it's kind of like, but then all of these other factors happen, like everybody moved out of the neighborhood, right? Like or gentrification happened. There's so many other economic factors that could be also conflated, et cetera. So most of the time when I think about the measures of success, I actually go to, so that's one of the things I didn't write in any of my grants, that I said I was going to measure like the number of mediations that happen, or if crime decrease in these neighborhoods or anything like that, because I know that that's not realistic. There are other factors that I can't control, like, for example, COVID, right? Nobody would expect COVID to hit. But instead, what I really look at is like working with the folks who are on the streets. How do they define success? And how are they using it? And how are they using tools? And then, so we try to use a mixture of that's why we bring in the log data to say like what people actually did versus what they say they did. But then we bring in the qualitative data to try to understand like, how did they actually see it being used? And then we do these online ethnographies to see like what types of conversations are happening, even like, say, for example, one-on-one, or what types of conversations are happening in the feeds. And, so when people are saying things like, I didn't know about X event, we actually can look back at the log data to see like, oh, did you, when did they actually go to that, and et cetera. So I think our measure of success really is situated within the community organizations and what they define success to be. But I think, like you said, like the type of work that we're talking about here is very complex, and there are many factors that impact, like simple measures of like, did crime increase or decrease? Did they mediate more conflicts? Like that's not a really good measure of success, because there's so many other factors that we can control. Same thing for the STEM
big scare quotes around metrics in my question.
No, that's a good point. I mean, same thing with the STEM stuff, right? We use traditional metrics of understanding knowledge gain. Like you saw that in the first few bits of papers, but then when we have these conversations with parents, there are all these other factors that they're saying like are not working. And so that's how we get to like phase 2 and phase 3 and et cetera. And so I think that, so if we went by just like STEM measures from learning sciences, it would say, oh, we did a great job, right? We had hundreds of girls go through it. Their knowledge, their STEM knowledge increased, their STEM confidence increased, et cetera. But if we sit down and talk to parents, and we really looked at like long term, did they go to another program, or was it just our program, et cetera? Like, we don't feel like we did well. You know, as an example of where we use traditional metrics, we do use traditional metrics, but then we don't feel like, you know, we feel like there's more to do. And that's kind of how, so we use the folks that we work with, essentially.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we're going to come to an official stop, and then we can continue